Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto married Ino Yamanaka in the future. 16-year-old Ino is stuck in the body of her older self. Now she must embark on the journey of an adult, a wife, and a mother while deep down she's still just a child herself. What does the future have in store for her? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 10, The Interrogation Room. Silence. The two blonde women stared at each other silently. The older woman's lips were pursed, while the younger woman's face was blank. The only noise that could be heard was the everyday movement of the village outside the window on the streets. The entire Hokage office was suddenly very quiet, like the entire building was waiting for an explanation. "Excuse me?" Tsunade finally asked, her facial expression turning into a snarl. Tsunade was not impressed with this joke. Ino, or this imposter, was taking things too far. Ino shifted her weight to her left foot and inhaled deeply. Technically speaking, I am Namikaze Ino, but Naruto decided to keep his mother's name. Tsunade stared, then shook her head. She opened her eyes. No, Ino was still standing there. How did you find out about Naruto's heritage? He told me. Ino half asked, half stated. She was annoyed by the old woman's slow response to this. Tsunade narrowed her eyes. That's impossible. Speaking of his heritage is forbidden. There is no way Naruto knows about his parents. Ino smirked, not your Naruto, at least. Tsunade remained silent. Ino took this as her cue to speak. Where I come from, Naruto is 37. Tsunade was certain that either Ino has lost her mind, or she was an intruder. Tsunade quickly opened the top drawer of her desk and pressed the red button hidden underneath a stack of paperwork. The silent alarm should reach Umbu within seconds. Ino noticed Tsunade's movement and couldn't help but laugh to herself. She had a feeling this would happen. While they awaited the arrival of the Umbu, Ino pretended to be unaware of her future doom and checked out her fingernails. They were painted purple. How predictable. Two Umbu appeared before Tsunade's desk. You called, Hokage-sama. Tsunade felt like punching the two for being so indiscreet. She nodded, then pointed to Ino, who was still pretending not to notice the situation she was in. The Umbu glanced at her, frowned, then looked back at their leader. How is she a threat? One of the Umbu asked. Tsunade's eyebrow twitched. She's speaking nonsense. Arrest her and call for Inoichi. The Umbu nodded. One grasped Ino's arm while the other disappeared. Ino did not make any movement against her captive. Tsunade was surprised that the blonde teenager wasn't putting up a fight. Ino allowed the Umbu to drag her out of the office and down to the interrogation department. Ino smiled in victory. At least her message will get through. Inoichi wished he could die. When he walked into the interrogation department and saw his daughter chained, he thought the world had to be ending. Ino? Inoichi asked, hesitantly. Ino stared at her father blankly, then smiled. Hi, Dad, Ino greeted happily, like she wasn't about to be groped in the mind by her own father. She didn't have anything to hide after all. Okay, maybe her sex life was something she should hide, but she didn't want to waste any energy on blocking her memories. She had to save as much energy as possible to reverse the jutsu that caused her and her other self to travel dimensions. What did you do? Inoichi demanded. Ino sighed. All I did was tell Tsunade that Naruto has a mother and a father. Honestly, is it that surprising? Inoichi stared at Ino. He stared some more, then turned to his co-worker. This is not my daughter. My daughter would never speak like that to me. That's why we're interrogating her. His co-worker half asked, half stated. Inoichi narrowed his eyes and turned back to Ino. Who are you? I'm Uzumaki Ino. Don't be stupid, Inoichi warned, suddenly very serious. There are almost no Uzumaki clan members left. Uzumaki Kushina had no relatives when she moved here, and Uzumaki Naruto is an orphan. And any children of Uzumaki Mito was born with the name Senju. Ino rolled her eyes. Ever occurred to you that one day Naruto would get married? Inoichi gawked. No. Ino asked, well, surprise, Surprise, he did. Inoichi was certain of it, this woman was not his daughter. He motioned for the team to move her to the interrogation room. It was time to study this imposter's mind. The team worked quickly, strapping Ino into the dome and then proceeding to their positions. Ino pretended to look bored, but truthfully she was enjoying her father's expressions. One minute he was confused, the next he was angry, then he was confused again. She shivered when Inoichi placed his palm on her forehead and then the world went black. Inoichi had to admit, the woman had quite an impressive mind. He admired her brain for a while, then proceeded to work. He unrolled a scroll of memories and prepared himself for the worst. He was bombarded with the complete unexpected. What will you name her? Before him was an image of himself, along with whom he assumed was his daughter, but several years older. They were in hospital and a newborn infant was in his daughter's arms. His wife stood by his side. He stared at the scene in shock. This had to be a joke. This was a genjutsu. Kaguya. Her name is Kaguya, like the princess of the moon. Inoichi quickly zoomed away from that memory. Deciding that that was clearly a fluke, he moved on to a new one. Sasuke will come back, Naruto. It was his daughter again, but this time she looked 16. She was dressed in a purple kimono, standing next to Uzumaki Naruto who was sitting in the rain, drenched. Ino held an umbrella over him to shield him away. Naruto looked up at her and smiled weakly. Inoichi was flabbergasted by the sheer chemistry that sparked between the two. Thanks, Ino. You're a great friend. Inoichi moved to the next memory, hoping to find something that clearly wasn't trying to play with his mind. What do you mean Neji is dead? Ino exclaimed this angrily to someone Inoichi could not see. His daughter still looked 16, but she was dressed in a navy uniform with a flak jacket. Her face and arms were covered with scratches and bruises. It was almost like she had just come out of battle. Her face was twisted in pure anger and sadness and her blonde hair was dirty. A softer voice responded, "Dead means dead, Ino. We're at war, causalities are expected." Inoichi knew that voice. Shikamaru. It had to be him, or Shikaku. It was definitely one of the Nara men. But war? What war was he speaking of? What was going on? Hyuga Neji wasn't dead. He was certain of it. Inoichi narrowed his eyes. This woman was far more cunning than expected. What am I going to tell her? Inoichi noticed his daughter's tears as she asked the question. Silence passed, then finally she received a response. Tell her that Neji died a hero. It's the best you can do, Ino. Inoichi slipped out of Ino's mind with a puzzled expression on his face. He has been searching her mind for hours, but all her memories were so vivid, so unusual that he came to one conclusion. She wasn't his daughter, but at the same time she was. And? One of his co-workers asked. She means no harm, Inoichi pointed out, she loves Konoha very dearly. But, she is definitely not from our world. There are many memories that conflicts without history and time. It's almost like she, time traveled. That's impossible. His co-worker objected. Is it? Inoichi asked, so many jutsus have been developed, ones that we always thought would be impossible, yet it was achieved. Why is time travel not one of them? His co-worker thought for a while, it goes against human morals. How? Inoichi asked, because she has seen what will happen? Because she will change the future by being here? How do we know that this happens? Perhaps fate has already been written and the past and future can never be changed. We can't take risks, though, his co-worker pointed out. Inoichi sighed, you're right. Keep an eye on her, I'll report to the Hokage. Ino was transferred back to the Hokage's office after she woke up. She was still chained, and kept under steady surveillance. She was placed on a chair, with several eyes watching her. She recognized plenty of faces, but when her eyes landed on one pair of eyes, she felt anger build up. What is he doing here? Ino asked. Tsunade glanced at the person Ino was referring to, then back at Ino, here to hear you speak. Ino glared at Tsunade, I refuse to talk with him here. Why? Tsunade asked. Because, Ino stated, I don't want him here. Is there something wrong with me? Naruto demanded. Ino glanced at him, her heart soaring. How she wished she could jump and pull him into a tight embrace, but she knew that he wasn't her Naruto. No, Ino whispered, this is confidential. It involves him, Tsunade pointed out. No, it doesn't, Ino stated, her eyes on Tsunade. Tsunade noticed the cold warning coming from the blonde. She has never seen Ino so frightening, it made even her, the Hokage, shiver. She sighed and turned to Naruto. Naruto didn't even have to look at her, he already knew what the old woman was going to say. He had to leave. Annoyed, Naruto stomped to the door, opened it and slammed it behind him. Tsunade sighed, all right, tell me your name, age, gender, registration number, rank, marital status and where you live. Ino inhaled deeply, I am Uzumaki Ino, 37 years old, and female. My registration number is 012604. I am currently married to Uzumaki Naruto and I live in the Konoha Manor, which at this moment does not exist. Tsunade frowned. The few Umbu and Jonin present were also baffled. Inoichi, however, knew she wasn't lying, he had seen it all in her memories. Of course, he wasn't sure as her memories were correct, but he had a feeling that she wasn't the type to lie. After all, she was most likely his daughter. Inoichi tells me you are from a different dimension, Tsunade pointed out. I believe so, Ino responded. How did this happen? Tsunade asked, Inoichi told me some of your memories were blocked off. Ino sighed. She didn't mean to block her memories, since she wanted to spare her energy, but she decided against it in the last minute. She had an image to uphold, her father seeing her make love to Naruto would just be weird. Of course, she hid a few other things deep within her mind too. I am a Yamanaka, Ino pointed out. Inoichi smirked. Smart girl. Tsunade didn't find this amusing, I cannot free you until you have proven this. You must unblock your memories. No, Ino declined without even thinking, I hid them for a reason, not just to keep them away from you. It's dangerous. How? Inoichi asked. I cannot tell you, Ino stated, but I can assure you, I will reverse this. I will get the real Ino back and then return to my world. Tsunade thought this over for a while, alright, that sounds reasonable, but I have conditions. Ino sighed, she also knew this was coming. 1. Tsunade started, you will be under surveillance. 2. You are not allowed any missions until we can trust you. 3. No one must know of this. And I mean no one. You must pretend to be 16, your old life cannot be lived here. Ino rolled her eyes, oh, I know. I'm glad we have an understanding, Tsunade smiled. Ino smirked. She wasn't so sure that this wasn't an understanding, but then again, she wasn't exactly in a position to complain. Author's note, so some seem confused about what is happening. Chapter 9 and 10 covered the events of the 37-year-old Ino who is now stuck in the body of her younger self. Yes, it is dimension traveling, with a twist. Adult Ino knows what's going on, you'll find out in future chapters why and how. Chapter 11, it matches her eyes. Uzumaki Naruto was not just the Hokage, but he was a husband and a father to two beautiful children he loved more than anything else, except maybe his wife. So you would expect him to be a happy man. Happy, unfortunately, was currently a dead word in the poor young soul's dictionary. It was a cold morning, and when Naruto's eyes fluttered open, he realized once more that he was in bed alone. He was curled into a ball, a position he often placed himself in when stressed, down or lonely. Naruto bit his lip, closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh. How he wished he could turn back time and make all this pain go away. Silence echoed through the house. Everyone was still asleep. Naruto was the only living soul awake. Or so he thought. The door to the guest room suddenly burst open and in stumbled his wife, or who was supposed to be his wife. Ino was already dressed in a long-sleeved purple sweater and gray pants. Her short hair was neatly brushed and tucked behind her ears, her lips had been moistened with lip gloss and her eyelashes perked with mascara. All in all, she looked ready for a day out and about. Naruto's first thought? He was definitely dreaming. but he was proven wrong when she jumped on the bed and started shaking him. Naruto! Naruto! She gasped in between haggard breaths. Naruto groaned and sat up. What? He snapped, a bit more aggressively than he meant. Ino didn't seem to notice his tone though, since she grabbed his shoulders and shook him violently. Naruto watched the world shake before him. I don't have a dress. It's a nightmare. Ino exclaimed. Oh. So that's why she disturbed him. Great. What? Naruto asked, confused. Ino continued shaking him. I went through every single dress I have in the wardrobe, but there is nothing good enough for a banquet. And how do I know if I have worn them before? I can't wear the same dress twice. Naruto grabbed Ino's hands and stilled her shaking. Ino was now staring at him, her eyes wide and desperate. Naruto watched her groggily. Women. They never change. Even his Ino, the one he married, the one who was 37 like himself, panicked like this over dresses. And she was a fully mature adult. A mother. Kaguya was supposed to be the teenager in the house, but quite often, Naruto questioned that belief. Kaguya did indeed inherit her grandfather's serious personality. Have you tried the usual? Naruto asked. Ino seemed a little confused. Usual? Yeah, Naruto grumbled, Astra's place. You always go to her when there's a Phashian emergency. Ino seemed even more baffled. Who's Astra? Naruto stared at his wife for several moments, debating whether she was an imposter or not, but then it all came back flooding to him. In that one single moment, he had forgotten that this woman before him might look like his wife, but she was not the same woman he married. He sighed. Hyuga Astra, Naruto stated, she's probably the most proclaimed seamstress in the Land of Fire, or so Hinata and yourself claim. Hinata? Ino asked. Naruto nodded. Hyuga Astra? Is she related to Hinata? Naruto grimaced. No, duh. They are cousins, or something. I never really bothered to ask. Anyways, why don't you go find something at Astra's place? Ino thought for a while, then smiled. You are a genuine lifesaver, Naruto. I could kiss you right now. And then Ino jumped up and dashed out of the room. Naruto sighed. How he wished she did kiss him. Ino stopped when she was halfway into the central business area of Konoha and slapped her forehead. She didn't even bother to ask Naruto where exactly Astra's place was located. Ino groaned. Now she felt like a complete idiotic fool. Should she turn around and go ask him? She thought of it, but she had a feeling he would be busy, being Hokage and all, so she decided against it. She decided to ask for directions instead. If Astra was the best seamstress in the Land of Fire, then someone is bound to know where to find her. Besides, she was a Hyuga, all Hyugas are famous. Right? Right. Ino tapped the shoulder of the first woman she saw. From the back, she was slightly shorter than Ino, had long wavy black hair and was dressed in white and red robes. She was carrying a toolkit and pouch, so Ino deduced that she was a kunoichi. The woman spun around, and Ino came face to face with Asuma's face, only younger, and female. The woman smiled, her ringed crimson eyes smiling with her mouth. Ino! The woman exclaimed, and then she pulled Ino into a breathtaking hug. Ino squirmed and coughed, and then the woman pulled away and laughed. Sorry, didn't mean to choke you. Ino smiled. After all, she could do nothing else. She didn't even know who this was. It's been too long. The woman gushed. Father and I were hoping to train again soon. We should spar. Ino panicked, but didn't let it show. Oh, yeah, sure. The woman furrowed her brows. Are you all right? You seem a little out of it. Ino was about to reply, but the door behind them that led into an antique store opened and a tall, dark-haired man stepped out. He had tanned skin, a few strands of gray hair on his head and beard, warm brown eyes, a cigarette popped in his mouth and his hands buried deep in his navy pants pockets. Ino's eyes widened and her breath was swept away. The world came to an absolute standstill as she stared at the man before her. She had to be dreaming. This was a sick and cruel joke. It had to be. For Sarutobi Asuma was supposed to be dead. Asuma glanced at Ino, winked at her, then he proceeded to poke the woman before her on the head. The woman grumbled and turned around, her hands on her hips. Funny, she groaned, very funny, Daddy. Asuma shrugged, you love it, kid. The woman poked out her tongue, then turned back to face Ino, who was still frozen in shock. I was just asking Ino if she could spar with us sometime. Asuma smiled, excellent. How have you been, Ino? I haven't seen you in a while. My recent mission dragged on a bit long. Akemi could not keep her mouth shut on the way home. The woman before him huffed, some great father you are. You broke a nail, Asuma pointed out. Akemi narrowed her eyes, a very precious nail. Asuma rolled his eyes. Ino suddenly gasped and came out of her shock. She glanced between the two before her and came to a conclusion. This woman, Akemi, was Asuma and Kurena's baby. The one Kurenai was currently expecting in her time. To think she was to grow into such a beautiful woman with her father's face, Ino could not bear it. The tears just started to flow on their own. Asuma and Akemi stared at the blonde in shock. Akemi was first to speak, you offended her, Daddy. How dare you? A woman's heart is a weak thing. Asuma lifted his arms as if he was surrendering, what? All I said you broke a nail. Akemi pointed her finger at her father's face, and Ino thinks nails are precious. Ino sobbed, but laughed at the two before her. How she missed Asuma. To think he was standing before her, so warm and alive. Her older self was one damn lucky woman. But how could it be? How could Asuma be alive, when in the past he died? So many questions with not enough answers. I'm sorry, Ino sobbed, it's so good to see you. Asuma laughed softly, I was only gone for 3 weeks, Ino. Miss me that much? Akemi snorted, I would never miss you. I wasn't talking to you, Asuma deadpanned, besides, you were with me those 3 weeks. Of course you wouldn't miss your dear old daddy. Ino laughed again. Yes, this man was indeed her old teacher. That much she knew. Asuma and Akemi escorted Ino to Astra's place. Along the way they told her about their mission, and how they were worked to the bone by some crazy old lady with a baboon as a pet. Ino laughed all the way. The father and daughter was so alike, even their facial expressions looked the same at the same time. The only Kurenai Ino could see in Akemi was her eyes and hair, but that was about it. Here we are, Akemi stated. Ino stopped and looked up at a small, narrow building with 2 floors. It was rather plain, with 2 small windows and an old wooden door. There was no sign or label. In fact, it didn't look like a shop for dresses at all. Thank you, Ino thanked the two. Asuma and Akemi shrugged, then excused themselves, since they had to report into Naruto. The minute Akemi said his name, she got a devilish look on her face and winked at Ino. What it meant, was still a mystery. Ino stepped up to the door, a smile gracing her features as she thought about her teacher and his daughter. Akemi, it certainly rang a bell. Ino raked her mind for any memories and then it came. Wasn't Akemi supposedly the one Hyuga Masahiro had a crush on? Ino giggled. She could certainly see why. Akemi was a doll. Ino lifted her hand to knock, but the old wooden door swung open before she had a chance. In the doorway stood a young woman with dark navy hair that curled around her face, red lips, white eyes, and dressed in a very elaborate kimono. Ino blinked. The woman watched her, then smiled, but Ino could have sworn she saw some disdain in the woman's eyes. Ah, the woman sighed, Lady Ino. A pleasure, as always. What can I do for you today? Lady Hinata has already left, if you were looking for her. She chose the most beautiful gown, I must admit. Matches her hair. Ino nodded, not knowing how else to respond, actually, I'm looking for a dress myself. The woman, who Ino assumed was Astra, narrowed her eyes, then smiled brightly, of course. Come in, I shall prepare the tea while you browse. Ino stepped in, wondering why tea would be needed, but decided to go with whatever Astra said. She was led down a very narrow corridor which led to a wide open room filled with racks and racks of fine, elaborate, colorful and finely decorated dresses, kimonos, furisodes, the whole lot. Ino had never seen so many dresses in her life. It was breathtaking. While Astra prepared the tea, Ino ran her fingers over the fine silks and cotton. There were so many, it would take forever to choose. Oh, how she wished she had a man to share his opinion right now. Nothing beats a man's opinion on a dress. Fancy the yellow. Astra's voice came from nowhere, just as Ino's fingers grasped onto a yellow silk gown. Ino jumped and turned around. Astra was standing in the doorway, a tray in her one hand and a measuring tape in the other. Not really, Ino stated, yellow doesn't suit me. Astra smiled, I agree. You always look the best in baby blue and purple. Why not aim for that instead? Ino nodded. Astra placed the tray on a wooden table in the corner of the room, then proceeded to walk over to a rack filled purple dresses. Ino watched her curiously. Are you looking forward to seeing your godchildren again? Astra asked as she pulled out a dress, looked at it, then shook her head and tossed it aside. Ino frowned. Godchildren? Oh, yes. Astra nodded, quite an intelligent bunch they are. Of course, you would expect that from Lady Hinata's children. Too bad Masahiro didn't inherit his father's intelligence. He is quite a disgrace to the family in my opinion. Ino bit her lip. She was feeling awfully out of place in this conversation. What was she supposed to say? Astra pulled out another dress, held it up in front of Ino, shook her head and tossed it aside. Do you have a favorite, Lady Ino? Dress? Ino asked. Astra laughed, no. I mean godchild. Do you love Misako or Daisuke more? Or perhaps the unborn child that is yet to be given a godmother? Hopefully it will be you. Lady Hinata seems rather fond of naming you godmother of all her offspring. Masahiro excluded, of course. Ino trailed off. She shifted her weight, and quickly looked away. She wished she could just ignore the question, but she knew Astra expected an answer. I love all of them. Astra snorted, but did not comment. She pulled out a dress and nodded, this is the one. I can feel it. Astra handed Ino the dress and pushed her into a small room where she was to get changed. Ino quickly pulled off her sweater and pants and pulled on the dress. It was a deep purple, made of silk and revealed her back. It was cool and soft against her skin. Ino looked herself in the mirror and could not help but think that she was sexy. She stepped outside to show Astra. Astra nodded, perfect. Usually women wear kimono to the Hyuga banquet, but you've never obeyed that law before. Besides, Lord Hokage won't wear anything traditional either. Unless you count those hideous Hokage robes traditional. I feel for all women married to Kage. Ino merely smiled, not wanting to offend or encourage Astra. From what Naruto told her, Astra sounded like a nice woman, but Ino could now see that she was a demon. An absolute disgrace to women, she never imagined someone to be so rude. Astra pushed Ino back to get changed. Ino quickly got changed, swallowed down her tea, which tasted foul, and then proceeded to pay. Astra, however, merely told Ino it would be added to the bill. Whatever that meant. And so Ino left the shop, happy to finally be free from the woman's clutches. Ino now knew that Hyuga Astra was terrifying. At least she will look stunning for the banquet. Chapter 12, The Hyuga Master Returns. Ino was nervous when she stepped outside of the Konoha Manor. For starters, she was supposedly assisting with the preparation of the banquet which was to be held later that day. Her mother had arrived at her home early in the morning to drag her away. Poor Ino, she had to rush and pack everything she would need, her dress included, for she would not have time to return. Why am I helping again? Ino asked. Her mother shook her head in disbelief. You help every year. It's a Hinata and Ino tradition. Ino frowned. Her mother gave her an odd look, then she remembered that her daughter wasn't exactly the one that had been helping the Hyuga to prepare the banquet all these years. She smiled apologetically and patted her daughter's shoulder. Ino smiled weakly. She was nervous. The first being that she had no clue what was happening. The second? She supposedly had godchildren and she was certain she would meet them at the banquet. She wondered what they were like, and who their father was. Mrs. Yamanaka grabbed her daughter's arm and the two trotted down the streets towards the Hyuga compound. Well, Mrs. Yamanaka was trotting and Ino was being dragged along. Several people in the streets greeted the two women along the way, earning Ino quite a few surprises, once again. The villagers have been nothing but overly polite to her since she arrived in this new world. Was it because she was Naruto's wife? Probably. The Hyuga compound looked almost identical to the one from the past, except it had a few new additions added. Like a large wooden gate with two dragons standing beside it. Ino gawked at the statues, amazed by the fine craft work. Whoever designed them was a seriously talented artist. Mrs. Yamanaka did not allow Ino to gawk for long, since she was soon being dragged inside. There were a large number of people scurrying around, carrying boxes and traditional decorations. Some were dressed in working robes, while others seemed to be more formal. Most of the workers seemed to be people from outside the clan, while the people in more formal dress all had the same Hyuga family eyes. One woman came to a halt when Ino stepped inside. She was a servant, dressed in a black yukata and a white apron. She bowed and quickly took Ino's things, claiming that it shall be taken to her room. Ino frowned. She had her own room here? The servant rushed off, soon to be replaced by another one who bowed down in her knees and took off Ino's shoes, much to her discomfort. She felt so horrible for allowing others to do everything for her. The servant then washed Ino's feet in a tub of hot water and handed her a pair of soft, brand new slippers. Ino took them, her eyes wide. The servant smiled, bowed, then turned to do Mrs. Yamanaka's feet. A male servant, presumably the butler, appeared and bowed before Ino. Lady Hinata has been expecting you. She's in the drawing room, if you wish to see her now. Ino merely nodded and allowed the butler to escort her to the drawing room, which was a large traditional room furnished with dark wood and elaborate paintings. Hinata was sitting beside the window, staring out into the garden. She looked just as elegant as a few days earlier, her hair tied up in a bun with a red ribbon and clad in a white and golden kimono. Hinata looked up at Ino and smiled. Naruto told me you might not be able to make it, I'm glad you did. Ino frowned. When did Naruto tell Hinata that? Making a note to ask him later, Ino sat down opposite Hinata. The butler served the two ladies tea, then left the room. I was thinking about Madoka, Hinata stated out of the blue. Ino looked up from her teacup, her eyebrows furrowed. Hinata laughed, if the baby is a girl, I want to name her Madoka. Ino glanced at Hinata's baby bump, then nodded slowly. That's a nice name. What does, the father say about that? Hinata's smile faltered and she looked back out the window. Ino felt her stomach drop. Did she touch a nerve? Could it be that the father wasn't even in the picture? Suddenly Ino felt like kicking herself. He doesn't know, Hinata whispered, I haven't discussed it with him yet. I will when he comes home. Ino frowned. When did you decide on the name? Hinata's smile returned, allowing Ino to breathe normally again. Hinata took a sip of her tea. A few days ago actually, when I was in your shop. Oh, Ino trailed off, so, you're going to use the characters for Circle and Flower? Is that what inspired it? The flowers. Hinata nodded. Ino smiled, then frowned again. So why haven't you been able to discuss it with the father? Hinata seemed alarmed by the question. She gave Ino an odd look, but answered anyway. I haven't been able to write letters to him recently. I'm far too busy. Ino merely nodded. She wanted to know more, but she could already see that Hinata was becoming suspicious of her questions. She couldn't spill all her secrets now, could she? The women sat in silence, enjoying their warm tea when a voice echoed through the hallway, and then seconds later the door to the drawing room snapped open, revealing Masahiro with a very annoyed expression, and a certain Sarutobi Akemi on his back with a huge smile plastered on her face. Lady Hinata. Masahiro shrieked. Hinata gave him a glare. He cleared his throat. Ahem, mother. What possessed you to invite this thing on my back? Akemi giggled. Oh come on, hero. I can be useful sometimes. Besides, Kana has a boyfriend and no longer has time for me. And she calls herself my best friend. She's worse than her father, I tell you. Masahiro groaned, while Akemi beamed widely. Hinata merely smiled at the sight. Ino noticed the evil gleam in Hinata's eyes and gulped. Hinata planned this. She wanted Akemi to annoy Masahiro. Ino chuckled. It was actually kind of cute. Well then, Masahiro snapped, make yourself useful and help. Akemi pouted, got off Masahiro's back, waved at Ino and then dragged Masahiro out of the room. He protested the entire way, until they could no longer be heard. Hinata burst out laughing, causing Ino to look at her, alarmed. Sorry, Hinata tried to calm herself, he's so different from when he was a child. Akemi is really a great friend to him, he just denies it. Ino quirked an eyebrow. Different? How? Hinata was becoming suspicious again. Ino panicked. This was bad. She couldn't let more people know about her problem. However, just then, Mrs. Yamanaka burst into the room, her arms filled with baskets of flowers. Let's flower arrange, ladies. She exclaimed. Ino silently thanked her mother for saving her. It was exactly 4:15 when a whistle echoed through the Hyuga household. Ino looked up from the flowers she was arranging into vases, confused. Hinata was already running to the doorway, a childish grin on her face. It was the first time since Ino had awoken in this new world that she saw the smile that 16-year-old Hinata always wore. Mrs. Yamanaka laughed, ah, the master of the household has returned. Quite early, he doesn't usually arrive until 5. Strange. Ino glanced at her mother, still confused. Mrs. Yamanaka rolled her eyes, quickly placed another rose amongst other flowers and then stretched her arms above her head. Might as well go and greet him. I'm sure Misako and Daisuke are eager to see you again, Ino. She recognized those names at least. Hyuga Astra had mentioned them. Her godchildren, Mrs. Yamanaka noticed her daughter's confusion and patted the blonde's shoulder. You'll be fine, Ino. Just be yourself. They won't notice that you're a teenage version of, well, yourself. Ino merely smiled weakly and followed her mother silently. They made their way through the corridors until they finally reached the front door of the main house. Outside there were several men, all dressed in Suna-style flak jackets and headbands. A few servants were attending to some of the men, serving water and other refreshments. Ino searched for Hinata, finally finding her in the arms of a red-headed man dressed in green robes that looked exactly like Naruto's robes. Ino stared stunned as the two kissed, like they haven't seen each other in months, or even years. Is that Gaara? Ino asked, her eyes wide. Her mother laughed, the one and only. He's. Ino trailed off. Really, she could not think of a word to say. Hinata's husband. Mrs. Yamanaka finished for Ino, yes, indeed. Poor things, they haven't seen each other in months. He still lives in Suna, you see. How do they do it? Ino asked. They make lots of sacrifices, was Mrs. Yamanaka's reply. What you two gossiping about? A female voice suddenly interrupted. Ino looked down into the pale eyes of a teenage girl, probably no older than Kaguya. She was rather short, with burgundy hair and rosy pink lips. Ino didn't have to guess who she was. She just kind of knew. Misako? Ino asked. The girl smiled widely. And Ino? She exclaimed and jumped into Ino's arms. Ino gasped and stumbled backwards. Now that kind of greeting she did not expect. And Ino, I missed you. Suna was fun, don't get me wrong, but I missed your pork buns. And I missed playing with water balloons. Ino merely smiled and patted the girl's back. Misako pulled away and turned to greet Mrs. Yamanaka. Mrs. Yamanaka chuckled. And Ino, eh? My daughter is so old. Misako paled and quickly looked at Ino. I'm sorry, Ino. I forgot that you don't like to be called aunt. Ino waved her off, not really caring. Mrs. Yamanaka laughed to herself. Already planning my demise, A new voice asked. Ino looked up, it was Gaara. He was much taller than she remembered, his eyes were like pools and well, he just looked different. She noticed that he had his hand resting on Misako's shoulder. Not yet, Misako laughed, I'm sorry, Daddy, but I don't think Ino wants you dead, yet. Bummer, Gaara laughed. Ino stood stiff. Gaara was laughing. He was laughing. Mrs. Yamanaka joined in with the laughter, but Ino did not understand what was going on. How did Gaara's death get into the picture? Hinata joined the party. She locked her arm with Gaara and smiled at him. He returned the smile just as warmly. It almost made Ino cry. Never did she think she would see him so affectionate. And then Ino noticed the young boy on Hinata's hip. He looked around Minato's age. He had the same eyes and hair as Misako, but his hair was much darker. And he looked a lot more like Gaara than Misako did. Daisuke? Ino asked. Once again she knew who it was. The boy blushed and looked away. Ino felt her heart flutter. Say hello, Daisuke, Hinata whispered into the boy's ear. He hid his face in her hair, causing the adults to laugh. He's just shy, Ino. Daisuke usually can't leave you alone, can he? Ino did not know what to say, so she nodded her head anyway. She glanced at both her godchildren again. They were beautiful. In fact, she was already in love with them and she just met them. Where's Naruto? Gaara asked. At work, Ino answered. Gaara nodded, kissed Hinata's cheek and then excused himself to greet Masahiro. Misako was now poking her brother's leg. How was Suna? Hinata asked. Misako grinned, it was fun. Daddy took us sand surfing. He what? Hinata echoed. Sand surfing. Daddy made a sandstorm and then gave us these boards made of sand, and we rode on the sand. Hinata paled, causing her already pale skin to look deadly. Misako laughed and patted her mother's baby bump. Ino watched in amazement as the girl cooed over her baby sibling that was yet to be born. Mama! A small voice yelled from the gates. Ino looked up. She could recognize that voice anywhere. A smile broke out on her lips as her eyes landed on the small blonde boy and she opened her arms for him. Minato trotted over and hugged his mother tightly, Kaguya soon to follow. Hey, Ino smiled, what are you two doing here? Daddy said we should come here after school, Minato answered. Ino patted his head and praised him for listening to his father. Hinata placed Daisuke onto his feet. The little boy poked Minato, who laughed and poked him back. Soon both the boys were running around and poking each other. Misako latched herself onto Kaguya and planted a big, soppy kiss on the blonde teenager's cheek. Kaguya pulled a disgusted face. Why do you do that? Kaguya demanded. Misako giggled and poked out her tongue. Kaguya rolled her eyes and tried to pull away from Misako's grasp, but the redhead was far too powerful. Kaguya sighed in defeat. No wonder boys are scared of you. The adults could do nothing but laugh. Chapter 13, A Secret Untold. Uzumaki Ino, a 37-year-old kunoichi, now stuck in the body of her younger and alternative self, woke up feeling like an absolute wreck. For starters, her hair was long again for the first time in years, which meant it stood in all directions in the morning. Second, she had a nasty headache and when she recognized her old teenage bedroom, her heart sank. That's right, she wasn't home anymore. She reached out beside her, hoping that she was dreaming and that Naruto would be lying beside her, but her hand touched nothing but the cold wall. Suddenly the bed seemed empty. She sighed and kicked her legs over the edge of the bed and stomped out of her room. She could hear her mother downstairs and her father in the shower 2 rooms away. Ino pulled her fingers through her hair, distaste evident as she clutched onto the long locks. She used to love long hair, but now it was just tedious. She missed her short bob. It was so much more comfortable. With another grumble, Ino turned around and stomped back into her bedroom. She grabbed an aspirin in the bathroom cupboard, swallowed it and then got into the shower. She might as well try and get into a new routine. It looks like she'll be here for a while. Ino ate her breakfast quickly in order to avoid her parents noticing something off. She then said goodbye and rushed outside where the cool air allowed her to freely think. Asuma was dead. She still couldn't quite grasp the fact. In her world, he's still alive. Then again, others here were probably alive who were dead where she came from. Like Sakura. Sakura? Ino gasped and stopped. She quickly turned to her right, heading directly for the hospital. As soon as she burst through the doors, a certain pink-haired teenage kunoichi stepped down from the stairs with a clipboard tucked under her arms. Ino froze. Sakura was alive. Ino felt relief and happiness, but jealousy and anger at the same time. If Sakura was alive then. Sakura-chan. A familiar voice exclaimed. Ino felt her heart shatter as the blonde teenager ran past her, brushing her shoulder along the way and almost tackle Sakura to the ground. Sakura was scolding him for running in the hospital now. Ino watched Naruto apologize while laughing his head off. Sakura's anger subsided and she smiled at him, having forgiven him already. Ino looked over her shoulder, hoping to see Sasuke appear beside her, but he never did. "Oh," Sakura exclaimed, finally noticing Ino. "Good morning, Ino." Ino snapped from her daze and looked into Sakura's green eyes. She blinked, then waved awkwardly. Naruto was giving her an odd look and it was making her uncomfortable. He was obviously still upset over the dispute she had with him a few days before. "Morning," Ino mumbled, once again looking over her shoulder. "Where was Sasuke? Are you looking for someone?" Sakura asked as she approached Ino. Naruto followed her, but did not seem impressed. "Not really," Ino stated, "I was just wondering where Sasuke is." Sakura froze, followed by Naruto. The two of them stared at her, their mouths agape. Sakura looked away, suddenly looking extremely down. Naruto reacted in a similar fashion. Ino frowned. Was it something she said? "Oh," Sakura trailed off, "didn't Hinata tell you the details?" "Details?" Ino asked. Now she was really confused. Sakura nodded. "He killed Itachi, and it doesn't look like he's planning to come back." "Itachi? Kill? Not coming back?" Ino frowned, trying to figure out what the girl was babbling about. Wanting to get revenge on Itachi she understood, since he killed the Uchiha clan, but not coming back? What nonsense was that? "I don't understand," Ino whispered, "when did he leave?" Sakura and Naruto glanced at each other, then back at her. "Are you alright, Ino?" Sakura asked, "Don't you remember? It's been 3 years since he left Konoha." Now this was news. Yet another part of the world that had changed. Here, Sasuke has left Konoha and from what Ino can gather probably became a rogue. While back from her world, he had tried to leave, failed to kill Itachi and came back moping. Of course he ran after Orochimaru, but he grew impatient and after he failed to kill Itachi a second time, he returned to Konoha. Itachi died of illness soon after, leaving Sasuke to regret, well, everything. He was never the same again. Until Karen came along. Sakura was worried now. She looked at Ino. She didn't seem out of the ordinary, yet there was definitely something wrong. Ino snapped from her daze and narrowed her eyes. Sasuke was a rogue. With that in mind, Ino turned around and stomped out of the hospital, leaving Sakura and Naruto behind, both still thoroughly confused. Ino was walking aimlessly through the streets of the old Konoha that seemed so severely different from what she was used to. Every now and then she would stop and stare at a familiar or completely new building or setting. Some things seemed the same, while others seemed different. "Hey, Ino!" Someone called her from behind her. Ino stopped and turned around, noticing that it was Naruto running towards her. She blinked, surprised that he was smiling and waving at her. Wasn't he angry at her? Ino frowned, then chuckled to herself. Of course he wasn't anymore. Naruto never held grudges after all. Naruto stopped before her and nervously rubbed the back of his head. "Hey, Naruto," Ino tried to seem casual. I'm sorry about the other day," Naruto mumbled. Ino shook her head. "No, I should be sorry," Ino stated. She looked away from him. She couldn't look in his eyes, for if she did, she might just do something she would regret. An awkward silence followed. "Do you want to go get some ramen?" Naruto finally asked. Ino looked up, surprised, then smiled. Why not? Sitting with Naruto at Ichiraku brought a wave of nostalgia over Ino. She couldn't keep herself from watching him slurp noodles up with a large grin plastered on his face. Yes, she was frustrated that she was stuck in her hormonal teenage body, but at the same time, she loved being close to a young Naruto like this again. To see his careless self. Of course, he is still careless, even as an older man, but he has matured. She missed his childish personality sometimes. Naruto noticed Ino was staring at him. He blinked, touched his face, then blinked again. Is there something on my face? Ino chuckled, no. Naruto quirked an eyebrow, shrugged, then returned to slurping up his noodles. Ino turned to her bowl and suddenly felt sick to the stomach. She pushed the bowl away and tried to clear the knot in her throat, but she could feel her stomach churning even more wildly. Naruto gave her an odd look. She merely smiled. She inhaled deeply, but the feeling in her stomach did not go away. Does it hurt? Ino asked, hoping to distract herself. What? Naruto asked with his mouth full of noodles. Knowing that Sasuke is out there, doing something that you normally wouldn't agree with. Ino asked, her voice in a whisper. Naruto looked down at his hands. It hurts, Naruto confessed, but I won't give up on him, yet. Sasuke will come back. Even if I have to drag him by his ears. Ino smiled weakly. You're a good friend, Naruto. Naruto beamed at her, then returned to eating. Ino sighed and looked up at the ceiling. The nauseous feeling was still clinging to her. She felt big, bloated, and ugly. It was strange. Are you on a secret mission or something? Naruto suddenly asked out of the blue. Ino looked at him, surprised. Naruto laughed nervously. It's just, you seem so different. You're not usually this calm. And then there is that stuff you're keeping from me about the other day. I'm sorry, Naruto, Ino whispered, but I really can't tell you. I'm doing this to protect you, not to go against you. Protect me from what? Akatsuki? I've faced them multiple times already. Naruto exclaimed, slightly annoyed. Ino winced at his tone. Naruto noticed this. I'm sorry, Ino. I didn't mean. Ino shook her head. No, you have every right to yell at me. I'm keeping something from you. What kind of friend am I? A good one. Ino smiled. Naruto reached out and touched her hand. She froze as his fingers brushed past hers. She looked up into his eyes. Those pools of blue that never seemed to end. Ino found herself hopeful. How she wished to hold him. But just as she started hoping, Naruto pulled away and returned to eating. Ino laughed as Naruto twirled down the streets on the way to her family home. It was good to see him in high spirits. However, every step Ino took forward, the nauseous feeling in her stomach worsened. Ino bit her lip and let her hand rest on her belly. She was unaware of her alter self's history. She really hoped she wasn't 16, hormonal and pregnant. That would just be horrendous. Naruto suddenly stopped twirling and turned to face her. You alright? Ino nodded. Naruto returned to twirling. Ino spotted her house and pointed to it. Naruto merely nodded and continued twirling in the right direction. They came to a stop before the door. Mrs. Yamanaka was inside arranging some flowers. Naruto waved at her. She waved back. Ino smiled and looked up into Naruto's blue eyes. Those very same eyes she looked into every day. The same eyes that watched her, fascinated and full of adoration. But now his eyes contained nothing but a smile. There was nothing like what she shared with her husband. Ino hoped she could change that. After all, how long was she going to be here? She might as well make it worthwhile. With that in mind, Ino stepped closer to Naruto, took hold of his arm, leaned forward and planted a kiss on his cheek. She felt Naruto stiffen. When she pulled away he was bright red. Ino smiled at him, winked and then stepped inside. Naruto could not believe what just hit him. Mrs. Yamanaka watched her daughter kiss the blonde boy's cheek and smiled to herself. Her daughter was growing up. How sweet. When Ino stepped inside, Mrs. Yamanaka smirked loudly, causing Ino to glance at her curiously. Yes, Mama? Ino asked. Mrs. Yamanaka merely shook her head. Young love, dear. Young love. Ino knew what her mother meant. As soon as Ino was upstairs in the comfort, well, somewhat, of her room, she rushed to the bathroom where she knelt before the toilet and puked her guts out. Feeling disoriented, Ino stood up, but the bloating feeling was still not going away. A sudden impulse to push her finger down her throat overwhelmed her. She had to get rid of all the impurities within her. She bent over the toilet once more. Once Ino washed out her mouth, something flashed through her mind. An image of herself, bending over a toilet. It definitely wasn't from today. And it wasn't from her life as a 37-year-old life either. No, it was a memory of her alter self. Now she knew what was wrong. She wasn't pregnant. Nor was she carrying some virus. Her alter self was bulimic. Chapter 14, Like Father, Like Son. Something was wrong. Ino watched herself in the mirror, her eyes narrow as she contemplated all that has happened in the span of 5 minutes. Bulimia. Was it not a eating disorder? Was it not all in the mind of the person who suffers from it? So then why was a 37-year-old Ino, in her 16-year-old self suffering from it? Why did she suddenly have the temptation to stick her finger down her throat to eliminate all the calories she had eaten that day? And why did she feel nauseous before? Bulimia does not invoke nausea. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. Somewhere along the line of the transfer of dimensions and bodies, Ino has somehow contracted her alternative's bulimia. Does that mean the technique wasn't completed yet? Someone has used 5 dimensions to heaven without actually completing it. Who in their right mind would use a forbidden technique without making sure it was safe? Not that forbidden techniques were ever safe. Ino sighed and pulled her fingers through her long hair. Something was going on, and she was going to figure out what, and return things to normal once and for all. Meanwhile with 16-year-old Ino. Ino spun around in the mirror, her eyes sparkling with delight. The dress she had brought a few days ago suited her figure perfectly. And to add to that, Ino only just realized how amazing her older self actually looked. For a mother of 2, she didn't carry much weight, she still had her curves from her teen days and her skin radiated. How could she have missed this before? A knock on the door shook Ino from her reverie. She turned around and noticed that it was Hinata dressed in a lavender gown. Her hair was pulled up into a neat chignon bun with several hair ornaments arranged on her head. Naruto was starting to wonder where you went, Hinata laughed. Oh, Ino blushed, I'll be right there. Hinata nodded and left. Ino turned to look in the mirror once more, then proceeded to place the single clip with a large flower on it just above her ear. There wasn't much she could do with her short hair, but at least she could wear a hair clip to give her hair some life. Satisfied with her appearance, Ino left the room. The banquet was just starting, with the first guests already arriving. Gaara and Hinata were standing hand in hand by the door, welcoming everyone. Naruto was with them, but he seemed to be off in his own little world. Ino decided to join him. The guests were expecting to see her with her husband, of course. Several strangers came in and greeted Ino as if they knew her. She merely greeted them with a smile, hoping they wouldn't pester her for too long. Hinata often glanced at Ino curiously, but Ino tried her best to act as naturally as she could. Naruto eventually started to greet people with a large smile, his hand resting on the small of Ino's back, which made her nervous, but she made no move to push him away. 2 familiar faces appeared in the doorway. One was a man, with dark brown hair, a goatee, and a ponytail on top of his head. He was dressed in a traditional hakama and kosid. Another was a woman with blonde hair and blue eyes. She was dressed in a blue kimono with a pink obi. She was smiling radiantly, but her smile widened even further when her eyes landed on a certain redhead. Gaara! She exclaimed and pulled the poor Kazekage into a very tight embrace. A blush crept to his cheeks, but he made no move to pull away. Instead he laughed softly and returned the embrace. The woman sighed. You foolish little brother, no letters. I was busy, Gaara stated as he pulled away to look into his sister's eyes. Temari glared at him. A man is never too busy to write to his sister, Temari snorted, you only responded when I needed help. Gaara smiled weakly. Sorry, Tem. You better be, Temari huffed as she crossed her arms over her chest. Shikamaru, who had been quiet all this time, laughed. Hello, Shikamaru, Ino greeted. Yo, Ino, was his response. Ino smiled. Tamari was with him, could it be that they were married? Ino always had the feeling that Shikamaru had a crush on Tamari. Tamari suddenly brightened up again. Oh, we have wonderful news. We're going to have a baby. Silence. Gaara and Naruto's first reaction was to stiffen. Hinata was surprised, but was a lot more relaxed than the two men. Ino glanced around her. What was with their odd responses? Wasn't it great news that they were going to have a baby? Something so beautiful and cherished should be celebrated. Ino stepped up and gave Tamari and Shikamaru a tight embrace. Congratulations. Thank you, Ino, Tamari smiled. Gaara snapped from his stupor and grabbed his sister's hands, fear suddenly crossing over his face. How? Tamari, you know you can't, the last time the two of you tried, you nearly died. Ino froze. Died? Died? Ino suddenly felt bile rise to her throat. She glanced at Shikamaru, who was looking at Naruto with a sorrowful glance. Tamari laughed and swatted Gaara's arm. Silly, we're adopting. And just like that, the tension melted. Gaara sighed in relief and smiled. He then pulled his sister into a tight embrace and apologized numerous times into her ear. Tamari chuckled and patted his back. Ino watched in amazement. Tamari handled the situation so calmly and happily. And Gaara, he was like a completely different person. Tamari hugged Hinata, then moved towards the main area where the banquet was taking place. Shikamaru was whispering something to Naruto, who nodded seriously in return. Shikamaru then shook Naruto's hand, and joined his wife. Ino moved back to stand next to Naruto, his hand immediately returning to the small of her back. This time, Ino didn't feel nervous. As soon as most of the guests had arrived, the two Kaguya and their wives moved to join the main event. Ino immediately moved to converse with Shikamaru and Tamari, excited to hear about their new baby they were going to adopt. Naruto and Gaara were moving around and greeting people, as well as discussing some common matters. Hinata sat down, her feet already aching from standing too long. Music started playing, and several people were dancing and drinking. Laughter filled the Hyuga mansion. Ino wasn't sure what was expected of her at this banquet, since she didn't even know what the purpose of the event was, but she tried to go with the flow. Minato and Kaguya were playing with Misako and Daisuke outside in the garden. Several other children were with them, including Masashi and Itachi. Masahiro and Akemi were standing together with several other people their age, laughing and chatting. Ino could have sworn the one girl with them looked like a female version of Kakashi, without the mask, of course. Shikamaru was eventually dragged away by Tamari, who demanded a dance. No matter how much he argued, he wasn't going to win. Ino laughed as they disappeared into the crowd. Ino! A male voice exclaimed. Ino spun around and nearly fell backwards when she collided with someone's chest. Two strong arms caught her, and laughter filled her ears. Sorry, didn't mean to scare ya. Ino looked up and smiled widely. Kiba. Kiba grinned and stepped back, giving Ino some room. Much like the other men, Kiba looked different as well. His hair was long now, he was taller and it looked like he was blind in one of his eyes. Unlike most of the guests, Kiba did not dress traditional, but more modern. It's good to see you. You too, Kiba stated, you've been dodging public lately, why is that? Ino blushed. Well, the truth was she wasn't exactly herself, busy with the children. Kiba nodded in understanding, then held out his hand towards her. Ino blinked, looked up into Kiba's eyes and then down again. Ino smiled and took his hand and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. It was a party after all, she might as well enjoy it. The two swayed in silence, but it was comfortable. Kiba did not ask questions, nor tried to make conversation, which gave Ino peace of mind. After a few dances, someone patted Kiba's shoulder. They stopped dancing and turned around, and came face to face with a tall, dark-haired man whom Ino could recognize anywhere. May I? Sasuke asked. Kiba laughed, nodded, and bid his farewell. Sasuke took Ino's hand and the two moved into place and continued to dance. Enjoying the party? Sasuke asked. Yes, Ino replied, I would love to know what we are celebrating though. I couldn't ask Kiba, for obvious reasons. Sasuke chuckled. Indeed. It's Neji's birthday. Ino furrowed her eyebrows. Neji's birthday? This is quite a festival to throw for a branch member's birthday, don't you think? And why isn't the birthday man here himself? Sasuke opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it. They swayed in silence for several minutes and then the song ended. Sasuke pulled away and bowed. I think Hinata is the only one who can answer those questions. Ino frowned. But I can't tell her the truth. Why not? Sasuke asked as he stood straight. His onyx eyes were twinkling. She's your best friend, is she not? She is. Ino asked, her eyes wide. Sasuke chuckled. I do recall telling you Karen is your best friend, but Hinata is different. She's the sister you never had, Ino. Keeping secrets from her is almost impossible. I'm surprised she hasn't approached you yet, I'm certain she's picked up your strange behavior. Ino stood frozen and flabbergasted. She wasn't that surprised about her friendship with Hinata, she was more surprised that Sasuke was telling her to tell Hinata the truth. Had he not warned her earlier with Naruto not to tell more people about who she really was? Sasuke must have noticed her confusion, because he squeezed her hand, reassuring her that everything was alright. Ino smiled at him gratefully. Sasuke in this world was so different from the one she knew. When the song ended, Sasuke excused himself and disappeared into the crowd to find his wife. Ino stood by herself for several minutes, then quickly moved to the side as a new song started to play. Ino sighed and sat down. She scanned the room with her eyes, in hopes of finding Hinata alone, but the heiress was dancing with Naruto. Ino watched the two and couldn't help but think of the 16-year-old Hinata who loved Naruto. Strange how here Hinata married Gaara. Ino noticed from the corner of her eye that someone sat down. She turned to face her new guest, and was surprised to see Masahiro. He was dressed in a traditional kosud and hakama and his hair was tied back in a small ponytail. It was kind of cute, since his hair was rather short. Enjoying the part, Masahiro? Ino asked. I always enjoy the banquets you plan with Hinata-sama, Masahiro stated. Ino smiled and turned her gaze back to Hinata and Naruto dancing. Why do you call her that, Masahiro? Isn't she your mother? Masahiro sighed and looked down at his hands. Then, determined, he stood up and turned to face Ino. She blinked in surprise when he held out his hand. Would you like to dance, Ino? Ino chuckled and took his hand. They moved to the dance floor and started to sway to the music. Masahiro was a fantastic dancer. The song ended, but they continued dancing until the next song started to play. My father always addressed my mother formally, Masahiro stated out of the blue, even after they had relations beyond that of friends. Ino looked up into Masahiro's eyes, surprised. She didn't think he would answer her question. Ino furrowed her brows, now even more confused than before. I don't understand, Ino whispered, Gaara doesn't address Hinata formally. Masahiro raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about, Ino? You know Gaara isn't my father. Ino's eyes widened and then she started to panic. Ino bit her lip and looked away from Masahiro's gaze, hoping he wouldn't push the issue further. This was a problem, she just gave away a big clue that she wasn't who he thought she was. Masahiro, can I steal Ino from you? Hinata's soft voice came from behind him. Masahiro let go of Ino, smiled and nodded. Just as he left, he gave Ino a strange look over his shoulder. Ino tried to avoid eye contact. Hinata noticed Ino's strange behavior several days ago, and was now going to get to the bottom of things. Want to take a walk, Ino? Sure, Ino muttered. And so the two women disappeared into the gardens, leaving their own party for a while. It was dark outside, but garden torches lit up the area. There was a slight breeze, but it wasn't cold. The air was fresh and crisp, it was perfect for a little stroll through the large garden of the Hyuga estate. Ino and Hinata walked in silence for several minutes. It was comfortable, but Ino was still nervous about what was going to happen next. Finally, Hinata spoke. Something happened, right? Ino stopped and looked down at her feet. Hinata stopped as well and turned to face her best friend. The wind picked up speed and brushed past the two women, but they ignored the chills that came over them all of a sudden. "I'm sorry," Ino whispered. Hinata frowned. "For what?" "You did nothing wrong, Ino." "I'm not your best friend," Ino stated, suddenly feeling bold. She looked up into Hinata's eyes, expecting to see surprise and perhaps even anger, but Hinata was smiling warmly. "I know," Hinata stated, "Naruto told me." Ino's eyes widened. Hinata looked up at the stars. "I noticed your strange behavior that day in the shop. You were far too shocked to see Masahiro, you even mistook him for Neji. I tried to muster the strength to ask you, but I could not bring myself to do it. Naruto noticed my confusion, so he explained it to me." "I'm sorry," Ino whispered again. Hinata laughed. "I should be apologizing. You're my best friend, yet I could not ask you a simple question. I am such a coward, aren't I?" "Never!" Ino exclaimed, surprised at her own reaction. Hinata blinked, then laughed again. The two sat down on a bench in the garden and silence fell. It was peaceful. Ino finally mustered the courage to ask the question that has been bothering her all night. "Hinata. If this is Neji's birthday banquet, why isn't he here?" Ino asked in a whisper. Hinata froze. Another breeze swept through the garden. Hinata closed her eyes and bit her lip. Ino panicked. She could tell the poor heiress wanted to burst into tears. "I'm sorry, don't answer that." Hinata shook her head. "He is here, but only in spirit." Ino blinked, then it clicked, causing her eyes to widen. Hinata started to shake and tears were now flowing down her cheeks. Ino wrapped her arms around her best friend to comfort her. "I'm sorry, Hinata." Hinata continued to sob uncontrollably in Ino's arms. "I loved him, Ino. I truly loved him, despite the circumstances we were thrown into together." Ino had no idea what Hinata was talking about, but nodded anyway. Hinata's sobs grew louder and she wrapped her arm around Ino, hoping to find more comfort. Ino allowed her friend to do so. While Hinata cried, Ino looked up at the party that was going on inside and spotted Masahiro standing in the doorway, watching them with saddened eyes. And then it all suddenly made sense. It was like a flash of images suddenly came tumbling through Ino's mind. It was strange, but it made her understand what was going on. No wonder she mistook Masahiro for Neji. He was Neji's son. Chapter 15, Reach into his heart. To say Ino was stunned would be an understatement. Of course, she held no disgust towards Hinata for bearing a child for her cousin, since intermarriages and such were still quite common, despite a lot of people's opposing of it. Besides, cousins are not that close genetically than some people claim they are. So often, their children can be very healthy. Ino just never expected it, because until now she always thought Hinata would marry Naruto. Funny how things worked out in the end. Hinata was still sobbing in Ino's arms, but she was calming down now. A few minutes passed, and then Hinata pulled away, grabbed a handkerchief from her pocket and wiped her tears away. Ino gently rubbed her back to soothe her. Hinata smiled a small smile in gratitude. "I'm sorry," Hinata mumbled, "that was unbecoming of me." Ino shook her head. "No, I understand. Can I ask one thing though?" Hinata blinked, then nodded. "Masahiro is Neji's son, isn't he?" Ino asked. Hinata's eyes fluttered, then she looked down at her hands resting in her lap. Finally she nodded. Hinata looked up at the sky which was covered with a few lone clouds. "The elderly of the clan were very strict about keeping our clan pure," Hinata began to explain, "so they practically ordered my father to ensure I produce an heir, with another Hyuga." "Your father chose Neji?" Ino asked, surprised. Hinata laughed and shook her head. "No," Hinata giggled, "I chose him." Ino frowned. Hinata noticed her confusion and laughed again. "I was 16 at the time," Hinata admitted. "I couldn't stand the thought of devoting myself to someone in such a way. Especially someone I didn't love. That's when Neji stepped in. He confronted my father and the elders and demanded that I be left alone. It was the most beautiful thing he ever did for me, other than give me my son, of course." Ino smiled when she realized Hinata was sparkling in radiance now. She enjoyed talking about this. She wanted to talk about this. She wanted to share the beautiful memories she cherished of Neji. And then Ino asked. Well, Hinata sighed, he was ignored by the elders, my father was impressed though. So, my father approached Neji and begged him to protect me. We were all surprised by this, my father always thought I was a failure. Wow, Ino breathed, I remember that. Your father doesn't approve of you in my world either. Really? Hinata asked, surprised. Ino nodded. Interesting. So Neji became your protector? Ino asked. Something like that, Hinata laughed, we took a different approach to what my father had in mind. Instead of Neji guarding me, we decided to have a baby. The elders weren't very happy, of course, Neji is only a branch member, after all. Ino blinked. Hinata never seemed to be the rebellious type. It was fascinating though, hearing this story. Ino could never imagine something like this happening with the Hinata and Neji she knew. They were close, yes, but not that close. Silence fell. The music, chattering and laughter could be heard of the party inside, but the garden was peaceful. Masahiro was still standing in the doorway, watching the two women talk. He did not dare move. Ino found this very sweet of him, watching over his mother like a devoted protector, very much like his father. How did he die? Ino finally mustered the courage to ask the dreadful question. In the war, Hinata whispered, my best friend told me he died a hero. A lump suddenly formed in Ino's throat. She looked into Hinata's eyes, looking for confirmation, and she received it. Ino looked down at her hands and then back up into Hinata's lavender eyes. I was there. Hinata nodded. I was already far in my pregnancy and was unable to fight. Kurenai was pregnant with Akemi at the time too. A group of enemies were heading to the village to massacre the women and children. Neji stopped them, but lost his life in the process. Silence fell once more. After that, I thought I would never heal, Hinata confessed, I was alone with a child and in despair. That's when you lifted me up again. You were there when I needed someone the most. A blush formed on Ino's cheeks. Hinata noticed this and smiled. Oh, Hinata suddenly exclaimed excitedly, and you dragged me off on a double date, and that's how I met the love of my life. Ino blinked. Gaara. Hinata nodded vigorously. I love Neji, but I wasn't in love with him. I realized this a few months after Gaara and I became an item. I'm glad you're happy now, Hinata, Ino whispered. I wish I could say the same for you, Hinata stated, pointing at one of the windows looking out into the garden, looks like your husband is looking for you. And surely enough, Naruto was standing in the window and motioning for Ino to come inside. The minute Ino stepped inside, she was swept up and dragged to the dance floor by a very enthusiastic blonde Hokage. Ino couldn't help but giggle at his childish excitement as they started to sway to the music. The song sounded familiar, but Ino could not quite place the name. Well, Naruto certainly seemed to enjoy the song. Ino was nervous dancing with Naruto, which she didn't quite expect. Being held by his strong arms was a lot different from having his hand resting on the small of her back. It was warm, touching and surprisingly familiar. She felt at home in his arms, like she actually never got dragged into a completely different world from the one she knew. Thank you, Ino whispered, causing Naruto to frown down at her. Ino smiled. Thank you for telling Hinata the truth. Naruto grinned. You are her best friend, after all. And Gaara threatened me that if I didn't tell her, he would. And then she would be hurt, since you couldn't confide in her. Ino nodded. They swayed to the music in silence for a while, merely enjoying each other's company. Ino could feel several of the other guests' eyes on them, but it didn't bother her. After all, to them it was normal for the Hokage to dance with his wife. Naruto, Ino called out his name in a whisper. He looked down into her blue eyes, waiting for her to speak. Ino was surprised at his height. How did she never realize how tall he had gotten? Can I ask you a favor? Naruto closed his eyes, tightened his grip on Ino's waist and pulled her closer. She inhaled deeply, surprised by the sudden affection, her heart started to beat wildly in her chest. Anything, Naruto whispered in her ear, his breath tickling her skin. A blush crept to her cheeks as she tried to muster the will to speak again. Finally Ino calmed down. Why was she acting like such a child? She was supposed to appear as a 37-year-old married woman for God's sake. I'm tired of not knowing everything, Ino stated, I want you to tell me everything about everyone. If I continue to be oblivious, I won't ever be able to keep my identity a secret. Naruto pondered on this for a while, but finally agreed. All right, I will tell you as much as I can. There are certain things I can't tell you, some stories you have to hear from others. And I can't tell you everything at once, you might collapse. Ino nodded and smiled. It felt like a weight was suddenly lifted off of her chest. What about one fact a day? That sounds like a good idea, Naruto agreed. All right, here is the first fact, Kiba is blind in his left eye. I knew it. Ino exclaimed. Naruto blinked, then laughed. How did he go blind? Just a tragic accident with a kunai on a mission a few years ago. He doesn't need his eyes though, his nose covers everything. Ino chuckled. Indeed. The two swayed in silence again, but the silence was comfortable. Both blondes were smiling. To the onlookers, they looked like the perfect couple madly in love. Their children, Kaguya and Minato, were watching from the garden, content that their parents seemed to be acting normal again for a change. Ino, I just had a brilliant idea, Naruto suddenly spoke up. Ino looked up, confused. Why don't we exchange stories? I tell you a fact a day about this world, and you tell me a story of yours. Ino pondered on this. Should she? Would it be safe to do so? Well, she was already deep into everything here, so it shouldn't hurt, right? Ino nodded. All right. Here is fact number 1, you love ramen. Naruto pulled a very disappointed face and groaned, not fair, I know that already. Ino threw her head back and laughed, causing several people to glance at her, surprised. Naruto pouted. Ino's laughs died down, but she continued to shake in laughter as she gently rested her head on Naruto's chest, completely unaware of what she was doing. Her body just seemed to move by itself. Naruto was surprised, but didn't mind at all. Kidding, Ino finally stated when her laughter stopped, here is the real fact number 1, Asuma is dead. Naruto stiffened at this. Ino felt his grip on her waist tighten again. I'm sorry, Naruto whispered. Ino closed her eyes and hummed. Naruto didn't have to be sorry. Death comes to everybody eventually. The two were so engrossed in their conversation, that they didn't realize they had been dancing for 7 songs already. Despite this, neither made a move to stop. They were very comfortable in each other's arms, even with a whole crowd watching them. Naruto. You can sleep in our bedroom again, if you want, Ino whispered, a blush slowly creeping to her face as she said every word. Naruto frowned. No, Naruto protested, you can stay there, I'm fine in the guest room. Ino sighed. That's not what I meant. I mean, move in back with me. Naruto stopped moving to the music, causing Ino to look up into his eyes, worried. Did she overstep a boundary? Should she not have suggested that? No, she was happy with her choice. She loved being in his arms, she wanted to stay in his arms, she wanted to wake up in his arms. Besides, he deserved to sleep in his bed next to his wife. Are you sure? Naruto asked sternly. Ino nodded, and rested her head against his chest once more. Naruto remained frozen, so Ino took the initiative to start swaying to the music again. Naruto soon joined her, but this time he moved his arm from her shoulder and wrapped both arms around her waist. It surprised her, but she did not pull away. Her face was on fire, but she was not going to act like a teenager here. No, it's time she acted like a grown, mature, married woman. Because that is exactly what she is. Mostly. After dancing with Naruto what seemed like hours, Ino excused herself and escaped outside. She was hoping to find her children and give them each a tight embrace, but no child was to be seen. They must have moved to play somewhere else. Ino sighed and sat down on a bench, enjoying the cool air that hit her hot skin. Enjoying yourself, Lady Ino? A female voice asked. Ino looked up, already not feeling comfortable with her guest because of their tone of voice, and inwardly cringed when she realized it was Hyuga Astra, the seamstress. Yes, thank you, Ino replied as politely as possible. What about yourself, Astra? Astra smirked and looked up at the stars. I only attend because it is my duty. I see, Ino trailed off. She wasn't really in the mood to talk to Astra. She didn't like the woman. Her dresses and kimonos were beautiful and elegant, but her personality didn't seem to be of the same esteem. Everything about Astra's demeanor sent warning signals throughout every part of Ino's body. Minato poked his head up from a bush and waved. Ino smiled widely and waved back. Minato giggled. Mama, come play with us. Ino stood up, excused herself and started heading towards Minato's direction. A sudden chilly breeze swept through the garden. Ino shivered. She made a mental note to check all the children were warm. She didn't want any of them to get sick. Lady Ino, Astra called out her name. Ino looked over her shoulder, annoyed that the woman was still going to disturb her, despite the fact that she had excused herself. Yes? Ino asked, trying to hide her annoyance. Astra's smirk widened. I would be very careful if I were you. We don't want your world to come crushing down, now do we? Ino frowned, completely confused. What was Astra trying to say? What are you talking about? Who do you think you are? Ino was starting to feel anger boil within her. Astra's smirk continued to grow wider, which sent a shiver down Ino's spine. Just be careful, Astra whispered as she disappeared inside, or you might lose something dear to you. Author's note: yes, I am aware that because Neji and Hinata's fathers were identical twins, they are genetically considered half-siblings. But that's just it. They are genetically considered half-siblings, but are not seen that way in the eyes of the law. Legally, they are cousins, and in many cultures marrying your first cousin is not frowned upon nor considered taboo. Now, I am not saying incest should be accepted and become the norm, but this is fiction, set in a world based on medieval and feudal Japan where things such as underage marriage and cousins marrying were not uncommon, nor considered taboo. Chapter 16, Unexpectedly Closer. Ino splashed her face with water and looked up in the mirror. Her short hair was still something she had to get used to, but she really admired the way the style suited her. Satisfied that the makeup was removed, Ino moved back into the bedroom where she sat down and started to blow dry her hair. Naruto came in and closed the door behind him silently. The kids are in bed. Minato woke up again, but he quickly dozed off when I told him we're home. Ino smiled. Thanks. Naruto shook his head and removed his robes. Ino froze, but sighed in relief when she realized he wore a black shirt and pants under the Hokage robes. Naruto glanced at her, smirked, and then moved to the bathroom. Ino continued to blow dry her hair, while trying to calm her sudden erratically beating heart. The banquet was a huge success. Everyone felt good about attending. Hinata offered for Ino and family to stay the night, but Ino declined. She really wanted to get the children home and make sure they were well rested for the upcoming week. Hinata understood and complimented Ino on how quickly she has taken to motherhood. Ino merely blushed. Now they were home, and Ino could not deny that she was nervous. It was silly of her to be nervous, she was after all the one who invited Naruto back into their bedroom. But she couldn't help it. Can't be blamed, she was only a teenager at heart. With her hair dry, Ino moved to the wardrobe to find her pajamas. She was still only dressed in a cotton nightgown and it was starting to become chilly. Ino finally found a blue tank top with matching pants with pink rabbits on it and quickly got dressed, since Naruto wasn't going to stay in the shower much longer. Satisfied, Ino moved to the bed and made herself comfortable with a book she had found early that morning in the study. Naruto came back in from the bathroom with nothing on, but a towel. Ino glanced at him, blushed deeply and quickly looked away. Naruto didn't seem fazed by her reaction at all, since he ignored it and moved to the wardrobe to find something appropriate to wear. Ino tried to fight the urge to stare, but she couldn't help it. She abandoned the book and locked her gaze on Naruto as he searched through some drawers in the wardrobe. She had to admit, he was extremely attractive. She had never noticed it before. Strange. He had a toned body due to excessive training and his skin was tanned, but the battle scars were all still there. Ino wished she could reach out and kiss all those scars so that they would go away, but she knew that would be stupid. Naruto seemed to be enjoying the fact that Ino was staring, since he chuckled and dropped the towel around his waist, leaving him bare. Ino shrieked and quickly buried her face in her book. Naruto laughed and pulled on some underwear. "That's not funny, Naruto," Ino stammered, without moving her face from the book. Naruto pulled on a pair of shorts and moved to the bed. He got in next to Ino and pulled the covers over him. "Sorry, I just love teasing you." "I noticed," Ino whispered, "all clear?" "Yes." Ino sighed in relief and peeked at Naruto. When she realized that he was indeed decent, she closed her book and put it away. She made herself comfortable and turned off the lamp, leaving the two in darkness. Now that she could no longer see him, Ino was nervous. She knew he wouldn't do anything, but the nerves were still there. After all, she had never shared a bed with a man before. "Relax, Ino," Naruto's voice whispered soothingly. Amazingly, Ino found herself relaxing. She closed her eyes and snuggled deeper under the covers. And as she lay there, Ino found herself feeling incredibly aware of her situation. It was strange, but all of a sudden reality hit her. She was a 16-year-old stuck in a body of an older and altered version of herself. She had suddenly been drawn into a new, foreign world where she was expected to be a mother, a wife, a friend, and so much more. She was no longer little Ino, she was now the Hokage's wife. Up until now, she thought she could handle it, but with everything that she has learned, the things were really piling up. Tears slowly formed in the corner of her eyes, and before she knew it, Ino burst into tears. "Ino?" Naruto asked, surprised when he heard her sob. He moved closer to her and wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her closer and held her tightly. Ino was in such a state that she didn't have time to react to Naruto's gesture. Instead, she continued to sob into his chest. Naruto slowly started to stroke her head. "Sheesh, it's okay. Everything will be okay. We'll figure this out, I promise." And as they lay there, Naruto felt his heart break for his wife, for he could never bear to see her in such pain. Kaguya was already gone the next morning when Ino sat down for breakfast. She gave Naruto a questioning look, and he mouthed mission to answer her silent question. Naruto and Minato ate quickly, then proceeded with their daily routines as well. Minato got his bag for school and waited for his father so that they could leave together. Ino was still eating, and she felt rather alone and lost, since unlike her family she had nothing to do during the day. Naruto came downstairs in his robes, kissed Ino on the cheek and then headed for the door. Just as he was about to leave with Minato he turned. "You should try to go to work." Ino blinked. "What?" "I said you should try to go to work," Naruto stated. "I'll let them know that you are not feeling yourself, so they'll leave you be. At least you'll have something to do." "I have a job?" Ino asked, surprised. Naruto laughed. "Of course you do, you're a botanist at the greenhouse." "Really?" Ino asked. "I'm a botanist in my world too." "Well, then I assume it won't be hard," Naruto grinned, then left. Ino felt somewhat excited at the prospect of having something to do, so she quickly finished her breakfast, cleaned up, then got ready to leave. She wasn't exactly sure where the greenhouse was, but she was sure she would find it. Greenhouses were not that hard to find, after all. The greenhouse was the largest greenhouse in Konoha and was located about a meter away from the hospital. There was a collection of wild flowers planted around the greenhouse in an orderly fashion and a stone path that led to the door. It was beautiful. Ino nervously headed towards the greenhouse and opened the door. She was greeted by warm air and the familiar and welcome aroma of herbs and spices. She loved plants and she loved her job even more. Several people were bustling around, watering and harvesting plants. There was even a nurse or two working with a medic on some antidotes. Ino glanced around her, mesmerized by the size of the place. "You're back!" a female voice exclaimed. A young woman, not even older than her teens, appeared around the corner. She had silver hair and dark eyes. Ino recognized her from the banquet. She was with Masahiro and Akemi. The funny thing? She looked like a female version of Kakashi, without the mask. It seems so, Ino stated, careful not to give any hints away. A lot more people knew about her condition than she already planned to let know, but she was still heeding to Naruto's advice to not share it with the entire public. The Hokage stopped by earlier, the woman stated, he explained the details with us. Well, he told the others you weren't feeling well, he told me the truth. Ino's eye widened. He did. Yes, the woman stated, I'm second in command here, so he left you in my care. Who's in command then? Ino asked. You are, the woman stated, causing Ino's eyes to widen, or well, you used to be. That was news. Ino never expected that she would be the boss, the head botanist to run this entire place. That means the entire village depended on her knowledge for survival when the time came. The thought was rather daunting. I'm Kana by the way, the woman introduced herself. The name rang a bell, and it took only a few seconds for Ino to remember Akemi mentioning a Kana some time ago. Nice to meet you, Ino smiled, this will probably sound weird but you look an awful lot like. Kana cut Ino off, Kakashi? Yes. I inherited most of my father's looks it seems, my poor mother was forgotten in the process. Ino was astonished. She had only guessed that Kana was Kakashi's daughter, seems she was right. I'll show you around, Kana said and turned around, obviously stating that Ino must follow her. Meanwhile with 37-year-old Ino. The sun's rays shone through the window and woke Ino from her slumber. She sat up, groaned and pulled her long hair into a ponytail. She was tired of her long hair already, no matter how beautiful it looked. With a yawn, Ino stumbled to the bathroom, stripped and took a shower. She then stumbled back to her room, got dressed and went downstairs where she greeted her parents. What do you plan to do? Inoichi asked. About what? Ino asked as she smeared butter on her toast. About the whole traveling dimensions thing. Inoichi asked. Ino sighed and took a bite out of her toast. I'm not sure yet. I know how I got here, I just need to figure out who did it. It certainly wasn't me, I don't have a death wish. Inoichi frowned. You know how you got here? So you know the technique's name. Ino nodded. And I am not the only one, I just hope Naruto remembers about it before something terrible happens. The longer we stay like this, the worse things may get. As Ino continued to munch on her toast, Inoichi pondered on his daughter's words. There must something he could do to help her. He wanted to help her, she was his daughter, whether she was from another dimension or not. What is this technique called? Who developed it? Inoichi asked, hoping that perhaps the information could assist them in finding some answers. Ino gave him a blank stare. That, I'm afraid, I cannot tell you. Ino, in her 16-year-old body, was bored. Being 37 and only stuck in a teenage body didn't give you many options for entertainment. For starters, drinking was out of the question because it was illegal, and Ino could really do with a drink right now. Another problem was the fact that she was entirely different personality in a world where she wasn't familiar with her surroundings. How was she to find something to do when she didn't know where to go or who to call? So Ino decided to go to the hospital and annoy Sakura, since it seemed like the only thing to do. Not to mention, it's been years since Ino had ever come in contact with Sakura, since she was after all dead in the dimension where she came from. Sakura was giving immunizations today. Several people, mostly children, and their mothers, were waiting for their turn to be shot with a needle. Ino personally always hated needles, but she knew how useful the things were. Good morning, Ino, Sakura greeted as she cleaned a patient's arm with an alcohol swab. Morning, Ino returned the greeting. Do you need an immunization? Sakura asked as she prepared a needle for the patient. The patient stared at the needle anxiously. Ino understood the patient's discomfort. No, Ino stated, I was just swinging by to say hello. I was wondering if we could get a drink after work. Sakura seemed surprised. That sounds fine. I'll be done at 5 today. Meet at the tea house where we usually have a drink. Ino nodded, despite not having a clue where the tea house was. All well, she would find out, one way or another. Alright, do you know where Naruto is today? Sakura seemed surprised by the question. He's training outside the village, why? Ino smiled and turned to leave. No reason, I just think he has a cute butt. Ino walked away, leaving Sakura flabbergasted. Sure enough, Naruto was training outside the village by doing sit-ups while hanging upside down from a tree. He was shirtless and looked as sexy as always. Ino leaned against a nearby tree and watched him with a grin. He continued training, not having noticed Ino's presence, and she intended to keep it that way for a little while longer. She just loved watching him. Several minutes passed and Naruto finally finished and jumped down and landed on his feet. He sighed and stretched his arms above his head, giving Ino one hell of a view. Her grin widened. Naruto wiped some sweat from his brow, then he picked up his jacket and moved to pull it back on. Ino moved from the shadows and headed towards him. "Hello, Naruto," she greeted, causing him to jump. "Gah," Naruto exclaimed, "don't scare me like that." Ino chuckled. Naruto gave her a glare, then he laughed and zipped up his jacket. Ino watched the zip move upwards with a pained expression. Naruto noticed and gave her a confused look. She smirked and shrugged. "So," Naruto started, "what you doing here?" "Hoping you would entertain me," Ino stated, "I'm bored." Naruto seemed confused, but he shrugged. "I'm heading to Ichiraku's now. You're welcome to join me." "I'd like that." The two turned and returned to the village where they settled at Ichiraku's and ordered ramen. Naruto was telling Ino about his training routine, and she listened. "So," Naruto finally finished, "why were you watching me?" "Oh ho," Ino smirked, "what makes you think I was watching you?" "Maybe I was interested in the tree." Naruto quirked an eyebrow. "Seriously? That's just stupid, Ino." Ino threw her head back and laughed. "Alright, so maybe I was watching you. You have nice abs, has anyone ever told you that?" A blush crept to Naruto's face. Ino smirked and took a sip of water. Naruto silently slurped on his ramen, since he could not think of anything to say. "Sakura and I are meeting at the tea house tonight," Ino finally said, "want to join us?" "Sure," Naruto mumbled between some noodles, "it's the tea house opposite your house, right?" Ino nodded slowly. At least now she knew which tea house it was. "Thank Naruto." The two finished their ramen, paid and then left. Naruto poked Ino, yelled "Tag, you're it," and ran off. Ino snorted, then started run after him. At least she wasn't bored anymore. Sakura was already at the tea house when Naruto and Ino arrived, out of breath. They have been playing chase the entire day. It was rather entertaining, especially when Naruto pushed her into the river. Ino couldn't remember the last time she felt like such a child. Sakura gave them an odd look, then she rolled her eyes and motioned for them to sit down. Ino collapsed on a seat and pulled her fingers through her wet hair. Naruto sat down next to her, which was a surprise to both girls. "I've ordered oolong for now," Sakura stated, ignoring the tight clench in her chest when she saw the look Naruto gave Ino. "Sounds great," Ino smiled. "How was work?" "Good," Sakura explained, "everything went smoothly. One patient fainted from the shock of having to get a needle, but he is all right now." "Really? I guess some people do fear sharp things that severely," Ino stated. Sakura nodded. Their tea arrived and Sakura poured each a cup. Ino ordered some snacks. Naruto stared at the tea, sniffed it, pulled his nose up, then quickly swallowed it down. "Tastes better than it smells," Naruto stated. Ino laughed. Indeed. The three sipped on their tea in silence for a while. "Are you all right, Ino?" Sakura asked. "Yeah, why do you ask?" Ino asked. "You just seem different," Sakura stated, "and the other day you didn't seem to be aware about Sasuke at all." Ino smiled weakly. "I didn't feel very well, so I got confused." Luckily, Sakura seemed to buy the excuse, which was a relief. Ino glanced at Naruto, who seemed to be in deep thought. She wondered what went on in that beautiful mind of his. Their snacks arrived and Ino immediately grabbed a pork bun and broke it in half. She lifted one to Naruto's mouth, which alarmed him. He looked her in the eye, then opened his mouth and allowed her to feed him. Sakura watched this, shocked and confused. Just what was Ino up to? Ino smiled and took a bite of her half of the bun. She noticed Sakura's glare, but shrugged it off. Naruto was staring at Ino, trying to figure out why the blonde was suddenly so interested and affectionate towards him. It was strange, he might be ignorant, but he wasn't ignorant enough to not notice something was brewing. 16-year-old Ino. Kana was very informative and helped Ino through the day at the greenhouse. She never left Ino's side, just in case another worker noticed something was off. The two mainly walked around and made sure everything was in working order. Once they did that, Ino watered some plants while Kana removed stray weeds. Once Ino finished watering plants, she decided to see what the medic was up to. The medic was male and unfamiliar, but Ino recognized the soldier pills he was developing when she reached the station where he was working. He greeted her, then returned to focusing on what lay before him. It was getting late, but it didn't look like he was anywhere near leaving yet. Kana joined them. He always works late into the night hours, Kana stated, we usually have him lock up. Ino nodded, glancing at the medic again. Ino bid her goodbye to Kana, then turned to go home. The walk home was peaceful and Ino was glad to arrive home and be greeted by Minato the minute she walked through the door. She knelt on her knees and pulled her son into a tight embrace. How was work? Naruto asked when she entered the kitchen. Naruto was standing in front of the stove, preparing dinner. It smelled delicious. Good, Ino stated, Kana was very friendly. She gets it from her mother, Naruto grinned, everything else seems to come from Kakashi. I noticed. Silence fell. Ino sat down at the dining table and watched Naruto move around the kitchen. She thought of the medic and the soldier pills he was developing. Naruto. I want to visit Chuji. Think you can take me there tomorrow? Naruto froze and looked over his shoulder at his wife. He swallowed. You know how I told you I would tell you one things a day? Yes. Ino asked, confused. Well, here's today's fact, Chuji is dead. Ino froze. She could have sworn her heart just shattered. That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.